Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're at, in your home, watching on your TV, your laptop, or your phone, you are a part of this family. And you can watch and listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists and search for past messages and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to Cornerstone America's podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family. We are in a series called Your Mess Matters. And we've been talking about life's messes because we know that life is messy, right? And there's all kinds of messes that we've been talking about over the last several weeks. We've talked about personal mess, emotional mess, relational mess. Of course, there's financial mess, family mess, marriage mess. There's all kinds of different messes. And this morning, I want to talk to you about master the mess, that we can actually master the mess. And I'll explain more about what that means as we get into it. This morning, we're going to talk about Joseph and his life. And if anybody had a messy life, I think it was Joseph. He had a lot of messes that he went through. In fact, in the book of Genesis, 14 chapters are devoted to Joseph's life, basically, running from Genesis 37 to chapter 50, from 37 to 50. And so he goes from one mess to another, to another, to another. So obviously, I don't have enough time. We don't have enough time today to go through each of those chapters. So I'm going to highlight, thank God, right? Thank God he's just going to highlight the messes that Joseph experienced. We get a feel for what he went through, and we can identify with a lot that he went through. I think he probably went through it much more severe than we did, but we can still identify with what he went through. But the story of Joseph is really about how God took him from being a prisoner in the pit to basically being a prince in the palace, becoming the second most powerful man in the world at that time, and saving really two nations. And God uses all the messes he goes through to mature him and bring him to a place where he is positioned to be used by God for the purpose and plan that he had for him. And so this becomes just an amazing story, one of the most amazing stories, I think, in history. And so what we learn, and one thing we need to understand about messes is we don't see it all, right? This is our problem, is God sees it all from beginning to end. He can see all the messes that Joseph was going through and to the very end and how it was all going to work out. But Joseph wasn't able to see the end from the beginning. Neither are we able to see the end of our messes from the beginning. And that's what makes being in a mess so difficult, is we don't understand how this is going to turn out, what's on the other side of the mess. And Joseph's life is a great illustration of this. And from what we understand reading the text, he went through it, with flying colors. It's amazing how he went through all the messes he did. We don't have really any indication that, it got him down, that he was discouraged, that he was complaining. It's like he just went through it knowing that God was going to take care of him. And so let's jump into it this morning. I want to give you 7 messes that he went through. And then we'll kind of talk about the answer, how we master the mess. I'm going to give you a few things that if we can do these things, man, I think we would really get a hold of the messes and really allow God to use those for his glory and for our good. So the first mess we see is that Joseph is mistreated by his brothers, right? If you know the story, Jacob is his father, right? His father's name was changed to Israel. God changed his name to Israel. And he had 12 sons from 4 different women and 1 daughter. He had 12 sons and at least one daughter. We could have had more, maybe that gives us no indication. There were 12 sons, 1 daughter from 4 different women. How many know this was a blended family, and they had their fair share of issues? Can you imagine 12 half-brothers and 1 sister from 4 different mothers? Just let that sink in for a few seconds. I know everybody's tired this morning. Just give a few extra seconds. And Joseph, being the second from the youngest, is the favored child. And so Joseph is mistreated by his brothers because they hate him. Listen to this, verse 3. Now Israel, talking about Jacob, his name's changed to Israel, loved Joseph more than any of his other brothers because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him this ornate robe. And so he was his favorite because he came from his favorite wife. This becomes very interesting in verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And then Jacob had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Now, so he starts off, his first mess is he's in this family, this large family, and all his brothers, man, hate him and can't speak a kind word to him. That's mess number 1. And we can identify this. We've all been in situations or in relationships, maybe even a family. You come from a family where maybe the majority of the family members didn't like you, or you had one sibling or two siblings that picked on you, gave you a hard time, maybe didn't like you. We understand what it's like to be rejected from our own family members. This is what he is going through. Then mess number 2, Joseph's thrown into the pit of rejection. Verse 18, he says, but they saw him in a distance. So his brothers are out tending to the flocks, to their animals, and his dad sends Joseph out to check on him to see how it's going. They see him coming from a distance, and before he reaches them, they're plotting how to kill him. Now that's how much they hate him. And here comes that dream where they say, right, come now, let's kill him and throw him into the cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Man, they really hated him. And then Reuben, a glimpse of hope here. Reuben heard this in verse 21. He tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Let's throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. In verse 23, he says, so then Joseph came to his brothers. They stripped him of his robe, his ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. So now he's into mess number 2. Not only is he hated by his brothers, but now he's being rejected by them and being thrown into a pit. Now remember, he's only 17 years old at this time. He's around 17 years old. He's only a teenager, and now his whole family, basically his 12 brothers, hate him, want to kill him, have thrown him into a pit. Mess number 3 is Joseph is sold for money. Verse 26, Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother, right? Oh, here's an interesting thought. Why don't we turn around and sell him instead, right? What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Verse 27, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother. Isn't he so nice? After all, he is our brother, right? He's our brother, our own flesh and blood. So they agreed. Verse 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. So now he's rejected by his family and basically sold as a slave. And I don't know, we've not been sold into slavery here, but we've been sold out for money before. Maybe you were in a business deal and somebody sold you out for money. I was working for a guy one time that his partner kind of sold him out, kind of sold half her part of the business to him, and then went out and started the exact same business, sold him out for money, and went out and started doing the same thing on her own. How many times even marriages have been sold out for money, left your marriage because you could get more money doing something else with somebody else? Relationships are often tossed away because of money. We can identify here a bit with Joseph. How about mess number 4? Joseph really loses his identity as he's sold into slavery, as he goes into a land where he's not known, where his family thinks that he's dead. Verse 31. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood. Then they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this, examine it to see whether this is your son's robe. This is interesting. Your son, it's not our brother's robe. Was this your son's robe? Verse 33, he recognized it, and he said, it's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn into pieces. Could you imagine the loss of his identity as he is ripped away from his family, all that he ever knew, taken to a land where he is a foreigner and sold into slavery? And then as he goes into slavery, we see mess number 5, that Joseph took a job he didn't want. Verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt, in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. He sold as a slave and forced into a job that he didn't want. I think even here we can identify how many times have you been in a job that maybe you didn't want? See, I'm in one right now. Not me, I'm not talking about me. I'm just saying to you, maybe some of you hear it. But Joseph's in a job that he didn't want, forced. He was in his own house with his dad who loved him. And now he's been sold into slavery, forced into a job that he didn't want, But that's not where it ends. Mess number 6, Joseph was punished for doing the right thing. Now, sometimes we're punished for doing the wrong thing, but there are times when we are punished for doing the right thing. And he did the right thing, and he got punished for it. He was doing a great job. He was falsely accused of rape. In Genesis 39, verses 6 through 8, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. After all that he's been through, he has character. He's refusing her request. He has character, refuses to sleep with her. In verse 13, when she saw that he had, so what happens, she is going after him, and she tries to get a hold of him, and he runs away from her. If you know the story, he runs away, and she holds on to his tunic, right, his garment, and he runs out. And she held on to the cloak in her hand, and he had run out of the house. And I think he also, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, Nike Airs. Remember I talked about the Nike Airs and running from sin? This is what he did. He must have had his Nike Airs on, and he ran from the sin. He ran from the temptation. And she had his cloak, but he ran out of the house. And she kept his cloak beside her until the master came home. Then she told him this story. The Hebrew slave you brought us came to me and made sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Now, that's not what happened. But this is the story she's telling. In verse 19, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. And in verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So now he's being punished for doing the right thing. For having integrity, he is now punished. But it doesn't stop there. Mess number 7 he finds himself in is Joseph is forgotten by the very people that he helped. Joseph is in prison. He is serving God while he's in prison. And there are 2 people in the prison that have a dream. One of them being the cupbearer. And he interprets Joseph's dream. And after he interprets the Joseph dream and the meaning of it, that he would be released in 3 days and go back to his job of serving Pharaoh, that he said, "Remember me." He said, "I've been taken captive and brought into this country." And he goes, "I was falsely accused and put in here. When you get out of here, remember me. Help me get out of here." And in verse 23 of Genesis 40, the cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph and forgot him. Have you ever felt like that? Surely, not in this dire of a situation, but surely we felt like that we have helped somebody. And then when the tables were turned and we needed the help, man, we felt like they forgot all about us. And here he had served this cupbearer in the prison, interpreted his dream, and he gets out and he forgets to help the one who helped and served him. This is the mess that Joseph was in. I don't know about you, but this would be enough for me to just kind of call it quits. When you're like, "I'm done, tap me out, I'm done." And yet through all of this, he keeps going and keeps trusting God and keeps believing that the dream that God had given him years ago would come to pass. And I think for Joseph, he had learned how to master the mess. He knew how to deal with the mess in life. And so I want to give you 3 ways that we can master the mess this morning. And these come right out of our text. We could talk about a few other ones. I want to limit myself this morning. How to master the mess. How was he so resilient? How did he keep on keeping on after all the things? I mean, he's on a constant downhill slide. I mean, one thing after another keeps going lower and lower and lower. And yet he keeps trusting God. He keeps going on. How did he do it? Well, the first thing, he remembered that God was with him. He remembered that God was with him. Here is a phrase that happens about 4 or 5 times in the Bible. It talks about the Lord was with Joseph. All through this text, if you go home today and you read these 14 chapters, you'll see that time and time again it says, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with, even though it was going downhill and the mess was getting bigger, the Lord was with Joseph. Even in the mess, the Lord was with him. And I think he remembered that no matter what he was going through, he knew that the Lord was with him. And one of the first questions we have when we're going through a mess, when we experience a mess, is we're asking ourselves the question, God, are you with me? Anybody ever do that? One of our biggest questions, we start going through a mess. I don't understand what I'm going through. Why is this happening to me? We start thinking, God, are you with me? And no matter what happened to him, Joseph's like, the Lord's with me. Somehow the Lord's going to take it. And what becomes so interesting is the way Stephen, in the book of Acts, when he's preaching to a bunch of Jews, is the way Stephen relays this message even years after, hundreds of years after. He's telling the story in Acts chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. He says, because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But notice what he says, but God was with him. Even Stephen got it. I mean, he had read this text before. He had read the story. He knew how many times it said, and God was with Joseph. And he says, but God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. I think Joseph had an amazing amount of faith where he was confident no matter what mess he was getting, no matter how far he was sliding down, he knew God was with him and that God would rescue him from all his troubles. When we're in a mess, we know if we're mastering the mess, if we're able to keep our eyes on Jesus and know that he's with us going through it and he will bring us through instead of being consumed by the stress of the mess. Are you guys with me? You know you are beginning to master the mess when you can keep your eyes on Jesus. You know that he is with you no matter how bad it's getting. And God uses the mess in Joseph's life to position him in a place in Egypt where he ends up saving the nation of Israel, and yet even though it hasn't been born in its fullness, but the 12 tribes are there. It's amazing. Here's the point. Here's what we need to remember. God is always with us. When we're going through the mess, this is what we need to remember, that God is with us. Nothing changes that. Romans 8, 38 and 39 says this. Paul wrote, he said, for I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, nor the present, nor the future, nor any powers, neither height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. He's with us. Nothing can separate us from him. But here's the second thing we need to remember as part of this God being with us. If you go to my next slide. For Joseph, faithfulness was always possible. No matter what mess he was in, he never stopped being faithful. And one of the things when we feel like God isn't with us, we start to move to this place where I'm not going to be faithful. I'm just trying to figure this out on my own. But Joseph continued to be faithful. And no matter how big the mess is that we find ourselves in, it's always possible for us to just remain faithful to what God has called us to do. And so no matter what mess Joseph was in, he continued to be faithful. He knew God was with him. Here's the second thing we need to do. We need to serve others. In the mess, we know that we're mastering the mess if we're serving others in the midst of our mess. Because here's what happens. In the mess, we become consumed with our mess. We become consumed with our life. And we tend to not look any further than ourselves. But we know we're beginning to master the mess if we can see beyond our own problems, if we can see beyond our own pain and serve somebody else. And that's what we see. Joseph continued to serve God and serve others through his mess. I know this is counterintuitive, that it doesn't seem natural. But this is one of the ways that we master the mess, is we start helping those around us. We see needs out there, and we start meeting those needs because we're just kind of sowing seeds for our future. If I'm going to sow seeds helping somebody else, I'm going to reap a harvest of God helping me. And this is what he does. Look at Genesis 40, verse 2. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker, who he had thrown in prison. In verse 3, right, he put him in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Notice verse 4. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. Even at his lowest point, when he's in prison for false accusations, he's still just being faithful. He's serving those around him. And he comes in one day after they had this dream, these two men had the dream, and Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. He wasn't just consumed with his own problems, but he is aware of what everybody else was going through. But you know you're mastering the mess when you can look beyond your own mess and care and serve those around you that are in a mess. I mean, he could have been wallowing in his self-pity, right? He could have been having his own pity party. He could say, I can't concern myself with anybody else. Man, I've got my own problems to deal with. God gave me a promise, and ever since then, my life keeps going downhill. Proverbs 11:25 says, a generous man will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. You see, sometimes when we're going through a mess, we just need to go out and help somebody. We need to get out of our own problem, forget about our own problem, and go out and just serve somebody, encourage somebody. Number 3, the third thing here is refuse to be bitter. This is amazing, I think, for all that Joseph went through. We have no indication that he griped about it, he complained about it, he didn't get bitter, he refused to get bitter. Verse 14, he said, but remember, he's talking to the cupbearer here, he said, but remember me when it's well with you, and please show kindness to me, and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house, right? And then he forgets all about him. He says in verse 15, he says, for indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should have put me into this dungeon. Verse 23, but the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot. He forgets about him. See, here's the thing. People are going to disappoint us. Intentionally, unintentionally, people will disappoint us. And he refused to get bitter, even though he had been forgotten about. How long had he been forgotten about? Genesis 41, verse 1, it says this, then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. For 2 full years after this cupbearer had been released, he had forgotten that Joseph ever served him, that Joseph had ever helped him. So Joseph remained in this dungeon. But at the end of 2 full years, that Pharaoh then had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. And it talks about this dream, and it's then when the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh in verse 9, he says, I remember my fault this day. He finally remembered, hey, there's a guy in jail who knows how to interpret dreams. Verse 12, now as this young Hebrew man was with us there as a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And then verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. And they brought him quickly out of the dungeon and shaved him, changed his clothing, and he came to Pharaoh. And this is the part where his dream, the plan that God had given him starts to come to pass. After all of that, he never got bitter. Will you stand with me this morning as we get ready to close in prayer? I want to put this last slide up as you stand up, and I want you to think about this. How to master the mess. What do you need to work on this morning? What mess are you in? And how well are you doing at mastering? Man, how well are you doing at remembering that God is with you? That he's with you, that God hasn't left you. Even in the midst of the mess, God hasn't left you. And that in the middle of that mess, you can be faithful to what he's asked you to do. How are you doing at faithfulness? Just being faithful to God in the middle of the mess. And then the second one is, who are you serving? In the middle of your mess, who are you serving? Are you looking beyond your own problems to help somebody else? And then the third one, are you refusing to be bitter? Are you not letting that mess get into your heart and cause a root of bitterness to spring up and just kind of taint everything around you? What's your next step this morning? What do you need to work on in the middle of the mess? Let's pray this morning.